So good evening everybody and welcome to another Seaquest webinar. My name's Cheryl and I'm one of the project coordinators along with Abby Crosby and Claire Owen. For those of you that don't know, Seaquest is a citizen science marine recording programme. We have a team of brilliant volunteers that go out onto the cliff tops and they record all marine megafauna for us. So animals like whales, dolphins, porpoises, basking sharks, tuna, all the big things in the sea. And the main aims of the project are to engage people with the marine environment, to collect data on the wildlife we see, and in turn this will all be used for conservation. We run a jam-packed annual programme of events. We do volunteer training days, we run talks, and we also have our monthly public sea watches. This is where everyone gets together on the cliff top and we all do a sea watch together. This is not only for volunteers, this is for absolutely anybody who has an interest and wants to come along and learn a bit more about seagrass. And also when we're on the cliff tops watching, we also see a lot of seabirds. So tonight we are joined by Mark Grantham from the West Cornwall Bird Group, and he is the chairman of the Cornwall Bird Watching and Preservation Society, and he will be talking to us tonight about seabirds in the southwest. Thank you, Mark.
Fantastic. Over to me. I would say can everyone hear me? Everyone's muted, but stick a thumbs up. I see thumbs up. Happy days. You never quite know if these things work or not, so a little bit new to everyone. I hope not everyone has seen all of these sort of slides before, but it's a bit of a mishmash of different things from some of the different projects that we've been doing as West Cornwall Ringing Group, but also things that we've been doing as Cornwall Birds, CBWPS, which is the County Bird Club. And it's a bit of a mix of different studies in here. So it's kind of a bit of a whistle-stop tour. And yeah, apologies if anyone has seen any of the slides before, but they're mixed up from lots of various talks I've done over the past year or so. But hopefully we can give you a bit of an update. And really, I'm super keen for people to ask questions, because I think that's the more interesting bit that I can waffle on for ages. But the interesting bit is if people have specific questions. I'll try and keep an eye on the chat bar as we go along. But Cheryl, if you see anything come up, just shout and I'll have a look and we'll answer questions as we go along. So if we, oh no, my presentation is working, there we go. So the background to seabird monitoring in Cornwall, or seabird monitoring nationally really, is the very backbone of seabird monitoring is the national surveys that happen roughly around every 15 years, and this is across the whole of Britain and Ireland. So as you can see, they go back to the late 1960s, 1969, 1970, Operation Seafarer. Roughly about 15 years later, we had the Seabird Colony Register. Another 15 years later, we had Seabird 2000, and we're at the end now. We're at the end of Seabirds Count, which is the most recent of the surveys that we're doing. At the moment, we're a little bit stuck in Seabirds Count, just because obviously, for obvious reasons, people aren't getting out and doing the kind of seabird studies that we'd like them to be doing. So our hands are a bit tied at the moment in when Seabirds Count will finish. But it's still, we can look at some of the numbers that we've got so far from the surveys. So to put Cornwall into context, I mean, if we only look at English English sites, you can see Cornwall has there are lots of different versions of the coastline of Cornwall, but it's safe to say that Cornwall has by far the largest coastline of any county, duchy, region, or whatever in England, and particularly if you scrub out Essex, because Essex doesn't have many breeding seabirds on the coast, then Cornwall's breeding seabirds are quite important at a national level, as well as what we might think of as at a local level. So if we look at some of the numbers of seabirds. So if we look where we were in Seabird 2000, which are the figures down here, and then compare them to where we're at with seabirds count, and these are the recent figures that we had from the survey up to the end of 2019. So these aren't complete at all. We've got obviously another survey year to go, but they give a good indication of basically how well our seabirds are doing. So in rough taxonomic order, you can see that, and these are counts of apparently occupied nests or pairs of birds. So the count units are a little bit different for the different species, but you get the general idea that for a lot of birds, there have been quite steep declines. So something like shag, big decline, cormorant, a mediocre decline, fulmar down here, decline, kittiwake, a massive decline, we'll talk about that later, and quite a lot of birds. Black-headed gull's a funny one, we won't really talk about black-headed gull. And then smaller declines for things like blackback gull and herring gull. But you can see most species actually have declines. The two exceptions to that are guillemot and razorbill, both of the auks, which have actually, since the Seabird 2000 survey, have shown big increases. So this is only comparing where we are now to where we were at 15 years ago. And it's quite interesting to look back a little bit further. So if we look at the numbers, and these are numbers just for Cornwall still, if we look at some of the numbers going back further in time, so these are the 4 surveys, so Operation Seafarer, Seabird Monitoring Project, Seabirds Count, and Seabird 2000 and Seabirds Count. So if you compare them across there, you can see that the trend for guillemot is real, that guillemot numbers really have been increasing in Cornwall over the period of all the surveys. And the same for razorbill. Razorbill has been going up as well. Herring gull was a species where we didn't really we saw a small decline between Seabird 2000 and Seabirds Count. But if you look from where we were in the late 1960s to 1970s, then herring gull has actually had a much more catastrophic decline, and that kind of puts it into a bit more context, that the decline is more real if you look over a longer period of time. I feel I'm kind of justified in putting a few graphs in here, because for anyone who's looking at their daily coronavirus updates from the government, there's lots of graphs there, so I'm hoping everyone understands graphs now. So there's a few in here, but not many. So if we look at some other species, again, fulmar was a bird that we saw had a small decline, but putting it in context, it's actually an increase from the Operation Seafarer in 1969, 1970. And you kind of think this is probably a more sustainable recent population level for fulmar. And for a lot of these birds, the increase over this period in the 90s was mostly driven by birds taking advantage of fisheries bycatch, and that particularly goes for fulmar, and it particularly goes for gannet. And gannet has massively increased, and a lot of recent work shows that gannets literally will just go out soaring around, and they'll be queuing in on fishing boats on the horizon, and they'll literally, there's people who do some tracking work putting video cameras on the back of gannets, and you can see them specifically heading down to fishing boats just to follow them. So these are birds that have done really well off the back of fisheries bycatch. Kittiwake is another interesting one that, yeah, we're worried about the decline in Kittiwake, but if you look where Kittiwake was 30 odd years ago, then yes, it is a massive decline. But if you look where Kittiwake was in the late 60s, 70s, then we're kind of at the same level that we were then. So although we've seen big declines, it's over what kind of time period we look at those declines. If you look closer into the past, then the declines seem absolutely massive. But if you look a bit further back, the changes are probably a little bit more in context. The last few species, puffin's almost the flip side. The puffin was doing really, really well in Cornwall with over 230 pairs, and now we're down to single figures of pairs at one site effectively for puffin. And that's a bird that's really, really crashed over the last 30, 40 years. We might be worried a bit about black-backed gull, but again, it's a bit of an upward trend over time. So we think things like black-backed gull, possibly cormorants as well, that have shown slight changes over the last 15-year period, are actually birds that are probably doing quite well in the longer term. So just looking at some of the very specific birds that I work on and that West Cornwall Ringing Group works on. So a couple of birds we work on Mullion Island. I won't go into too much about where Mullion Island is and what's on it, because I kind of think most people know roughly where it is. But this is the Ringing Group on Mullion Island. So it's a kayak ride, a short kayak ride over to the island from Mullion Cove. And we generally just go over 2 or 3 times in the year to kind of minimise disturbance of the island. The photo is taken when there aren't actually any breeding birds there, so it looks a bit deserted. But in the breeding season, it's absolutely heaving with cormorants and with great black-backed gulls. So some of the birds that we're most interested on Mullion Island are cormorants. So we're always vying for which is the most important site in Cornwall for cormorant and black-backed gull, and it's between Mullion Island or the Wildlife Trust's Loo Island up near Loo, surprisingly. And both those have about similar numbers of cormorants and great black-backed gulls. So probably about 80, 90, 100 pairs of great black-backed gulls and about 45, 50 pairs of cormorants. And on Mullion Island, the cormorants are nesting on the flat, very top of the island. All of these individual nests that you can see here will wash away in the winter. So the cormorants are on there from January, February time, rebuilding these sort of, they look like stick platforms, but they're actually built from mallow, which covers the island later in the season and makes our monitoring of gulls in particular really difficult. So this is the mallow if you look on the second picture. So this is the mallow that they're actually snapping off and using to build these kind of platforms that they're nesting on. So the work that we do on cormorants is we're doing monitoring. So we know how many pairs are breeding. It's been a bit difficult this year because we couldn't make it over to the island. I've got a little video I can show people at the end if anyone's interested, which is video that we've taken from the mainland, really stretching what our cameras and video cameras can do to try and get an idea of how birds are doing on the island from afar. So we count the numbers of birds that are there, and we try and get an idea of the productivity and look how that changes between years. And then what we also do as well is colour mark chicks. So where we can, where it's safe to do so, which it not always is, if the birds are nesting on a cliff edge, we can't actually get to them safely. If they're on top of the island, we can. Then what we're doing is marking them with a single coloured ring. So they get a metal ring as well, but they get a single colouring with a code on it, and that allows us to sort of follow their progress and look at how birds are surviving and how birds are moving. So these are just a couple of our marked cormorants. So this is the one on the left. This is our most impressive bird, which was photographed in northern Spain, and we'll talk a little bit further along about how the kind of the Bay of Biscay effectively, or the Atlantic facing coasts of Europe, are kind of what we call one big meta-population, that birds just mill around this whole meta-population. So in effect we can talk about Cornwall, but we need to talk about the whole of the what's called the Celtic fringe, and we need to think of that as one unit, because that's how the birds think of it. They don't think of Cornwall as Cornwall or the Isles of Scilly as the Isles of Scilly. They think of it as one big unit. And just to completely throw that a little bit, the photo on the right shows, so this is one of our birds, and this is at Cheddar Reservoir in Somerset. And it's actually stood next to a cormorant from the Netherlands, ringed as a chick on an island called De Krupa Island, which is a man-made island as part of an experiment looking at coastal reclaim in the Netherlands. It didn't work, and it's a massive nature reserve now. So yeah, goes against what I said earlier, that there's a meta-population of birds on the Atlantic-facing coast, but obviously this bird from the Netherlands is mixing in with one of our Mullion birds So there is a bit of mixing between the populations anyway, but primarily you'll see in a bit that we mostly think of these birds as Celtic fringe birds. One of the issues we found on mullein, I don't know if people probably saw this in the news or on social media and things like that, that when we've been going over to mullein, we've always noticed there are lots of elastic bands over the island. It was always a bit of a mystery. And we took the opportunity at the end of last year, in the autumn, while it was still calm enough to get a kayak over, but there were no birds on the island. We went over and had a closer look. And we found literally tens of thousands of elastic bands around the island. And what we think, looking at them, is that they're actually elastic bands from daffodil picking on the mainland, and these are brought over. They're picked up by gulls that are scavenging in the fields, and then they're brought over to the island with birds when they're roosting on the island. And the question's been raised whether or not this is a problem or not, and it was a bit of a head scratch, because obviously rubbers are a natural. We call them elastic bands, but they're really rubber bands, and rubber being a natural sort of material, is that a problem or not? And we're not quite sure of the answer to that. More of an issue was these little balls that we found while we were over there as well. And for anyone that can picture an owl pellet, at least, then you'll see that that's kind of the shape of an owl pellet or a pellet. And gulls will do exactly the same thing as owls will, that when they're eating anything distasteful, so a lot of blackback gulls in particular will feed on birds, and they'll feed on rabbits and things like that. And they actually regurgitate pellets in exactly the same way. And to me, when we found these look like regurgitated pellets. And what it is, it's there is a name for it, but I can't remember what the name is. It's the clippings, the offcuts of the mending of fishing nets and the mending of pots. And you can see here, slightly more what they look like. And this is just a sample of some of these plastic pellets that we found across the island. And there weren't thousands of these, but there were hundreds. And this is just a scattering of them. And again, these are all things that the birds have picked up as part of their normal foraging, created into a pellet, and they've regurgitated them on the island in the evening when they've been going to roost. And obviously it's just another example of kind of how all-pervading plastics pollution is in the wider environment. So going away from Mullion Island and going a bit further around the coast, or both coasts really, this is a bird I absolutely love. I love kittiwakes. I have a bit of an unhealthy obsession with kittiwakes. I was out looking at kittiwakes today, and if anyone can see my webcam behind me, it's not like kittiwake wallpaper, it's just virtual wallpaper. But a photo I took today over at Portreath of my beloved kittiwakes. So we did quite a bit of work on kittiwakes in Cornwall, only in recent years, and you'll see a slide later that shows what you can achieve if you really put extra effort into a very specific project. So Kittiwake is actually Britain's most abundant gull. Globally, it's I think it might even be the world's most common gull species. I'm not entirely sure about that, but it's a very, very common bird. And yet, as you saw from the slide earlier, there have been big crashes. Whether they're natural or not is hard to say. But nationally, since the 80s, we've seen this big decline. And it's basically a contraction of the breeding range. So if you look at just a very Anglo-centric view of this, then almost 60% of colonies along the south coast from Kent to the Isles of Scilly have been abandoned since the 80s. If you look slightly further afield, it's gone extinct as a breeding bird in Spain. It's gone extinct as a breeding bird in southern France, with only a few remnant populations in the north of France. And it's slowly going extinct from the Channel Islands as well. And if you look in Cornwall, again, numbers are just dropping in Cornwall. And it's causing real concern that, it's not much of a stretch of the imagination to think that we might lose kittiwakes completely from Cornwall. And if we look at some of the numbers, so back in Seabird 2000, there were 11 kittiwake colonies in Cornwall with about just shy of 2,000 pairs nesting in them. If you bring it a little bit more up to date, but not quite up to date, so back in 2016, when I was doing some monitoring, we had 5 Cornish colonies and we had about 900 pairs. And you can see already we've halved the population in the number of colonies and the number of pairs just in that 15-year period. So in 2016, that was the kind of spread of the colonies that we had. I know it kind of looks like it adds up to more than 5, but it doesn't quite. So there are all those pairs, but what's striking is how unsuccessful they are. So up at Porthmisson, which is up near Trevone, there were 340 nests, but they only fledged 3 chicks. Newquay Gazelle, 100 nests, fledged 0 chicks. Portreath, one of the sites that I look at quite a lot, in 0 chicks. Portreath Western Cove, slightly tucked in, a bit more sheltered, a little bit more successful, 100 nests, 60 chicks. Treorvis Head was probably what we look at the most. Again, 120 nests and 100 chicks. So it's great to say that, yeah, we may have had 900 nests in the county in 2016, but their productivity is so low that that's not at all sustainable for the population. So if we add those numbers in, 2019, 3 Cornish colonies and about 600 pairs. And you can see this sort of gradual but quite precipitous decline of kittiwakes. And if you look at those breeding figures in a little bit more detail, you assume that we need about 1.2 chicks per pair to maintain a sustainable population of kittiwakes. And the sites that I look at in a more intensive way in Portreath, we have way less than 1. So, well, between Portreath and Treorvis, we have about 0.8 chicks per pair at those sites. So even the sites that are producing chicks, it's not at a sustainable level. So the work that we do with kittiwakes is mostly just as I was. This could have been me today, sat in exactly the same spot, slightly less hair, I'd imagine, because this was a few years ago. But basically, sat on a cliff top, staring down, looking at kittiwakes. You can stare up at kittiwakes, and this is one of the our sort of ringing trips down into Rinsey Cove. So yeah, this is Rinsey. Rinsey was a site that used to have about 120 pairs of kittiwakes. It now has 6, and that's another site that in my limited time in Cornwall, I've seen that absolutely crash to nothing. So what we're doing is sitting on cliffs and we're looking at this kind of thing. So this is actually a photograph from just this morning. So it's quite nice that I could actually get out this morning and have a proper look at some of my fieldwork sites, because with COVID, all of the BTO fieldwork has been suspended, and it was literally, we've been allowed to go out and do monitoring fieldwork as of yesterday. So I was working yesterday, so today was my first chance, so I grabbed it. So these are kittiwakes at Western Cove in Portreath, and basically, you know, what better day to sort of sit on a cliff top and just stare down at kittiwakes on ledges. Absolutely amazing birds. So they're only at the start of their breeding season at the moment, so none of them have got eggs, so they're all just prospecting and sort of pairing up, reacquainting themselves. So in here again, if I mention the Celtic fringe, in here today we saw 2 French ringed birds and 1 Welsh ringed bird. These are birds that were ringed as chicks in different colonies that have come into the colony at Portreath to breed, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There you go, Dave. There's one of yours. So if you look at, it's always hard to count how many birds there are. So this is one of Dave Williams' photos from of Portreath, looking back from a boat, looking back at the colony, and having these kind of photos from a different angle allows you to physically go through, and I think Dave will nod when I say this, but you can go through and put dots on every single ledge that there's a kittiwake on, and go through these things, and you can physically count birds by having high-res photographs you can go through. So we know reasonably well how many how many birds there are breeding at all of these sites, because they're quite well photographed. Thanks to, I say thanks to Dave, but it's thanks to Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust, who they're running the seal identification sort of trips out, and they're very generous enough that Dave goes along and sends me photos of kittiwakes on cliffs, which is absolutely brilliant. So it's a nice bit of joint working that we can piggyback on the on that sort of funded project to get this kind of information. So what we can take from those photos is I've sat and I've gone through, and at each of the blocks of this particular colony, we've gone through and we've identified and numbered individual nests. So by having all of these nests individually numbered, I know that this is A8, A9, A10. Then we can follow those nests through the entire breeding season, and it helps us to look at how successful these birds are and give us that kind of level of that figure for productivity that we're most interested in. So looking at why productivity in these birds is so low, and there's quite a few different factors. At the massive scale, the gradual warming of the oceans is pushing their kittiwake's prey species further north. So they are actually losing their local supply of food. And as the supply of food in the breeding season is moving north, then birds respond by moving north as well, which is why they're disappearing from the southern edge of the range and gradually disappearing further and further north. So numbers are going down anyway, but then there's increased predation risk that I think if you have a healthy population, it can defend itself against predators. If you have a population that's declining, then it's less able to defend itself against predators. So this was a couple of years ago up at Porthmessen, and I was only there for 45 minutes, and I saw this peregrine, a young peregrine, appear in the colony, and it looked round for a bit. But basically, if you're a peregrine, if you get pecked in the eye once, you will die because you will not be able to feed. So for a peregrine, it's not going to risk going into a colony of 600 kittiwakes. If that colony has been depleted down to maybe just 100, then it's worth the risk from a peregrine to go into that colony. So I watched it eat the one chick from that nest. It then went to this nest over here, this chick. It then hopped down to here at this chick. All that time, this bird here still sat there trying to defend its one chick, and there was an almighty fight where the peregrine risked a peck in the eye, and eventually this bird got pushed off and the peregrine flew off with that last chick. So you can see the investment that birds have, and in 45 minutes, a peregrine, a rare breeding bird in the UK, will take 4 chicks, and when we're looking for productivity of 1.2 chicks per pair, that's 4 pairs that have produced 0, and that was just in 45 minutes. So you can understand that there's that kind of pressure on birds, but that's quite a natural pressure. We can tolerate that. That is natural, and kittiwakes respond to that by abandoning colonies and moving somewhere else. What isn't a very natural pressure is perhaps what was happening in Newquay, and as for a long period Newquay did quite badly as a colony, and really, I mean, what you can see here is little coast-steering groups. So there are coast-steerers that my screen is very sunny, I can't see my own screen. So there's a coast-steering group here, and basically they're jumping off the rocks, kind of right in front of the colony. And although you might think, well, that's a little bit of disturbance, but not much. But if there's a coast-steering group every hour, every day, through the whole of the summer, through the whole of the breeding period, then that kind of chronic disturbance has quite an impact on kittiwakes. The flip side to that, the really good part of this story, was that once the problem was identified, we could do something about it. And the Marine Coastal Code Group, basically pushed by the Wildlife Trust, were able to talk to coast-steering companies and other coastal zone users in Newquay, and basically come to a sort of an informal agreement, almost a general understanding that they would they would suspend their coast steering activity until the kittiwakes had bred successfully for the year. As soon as the kittiwakes were gone, July, August or earlier if the colony had failed, then they could start coast steering again, and that's worked really well. So it's given the birds a break from that constant hourly disturbance. So if we understand some of the problems that the birds are facing, we can actually start to deal with them. So the site that we look at, so this is Rinsey. So it's a site that we have to kayak around. So this is my field work over the summer is a double kayak and a ladder. So when we're marking chicks, which we can follow through and look at survival rates, then yeah, you've got a kayak on top of your car to go out to get to the site, but then you also have to have a ladder to get up to the nest as well. And you do get some strange looks when you turn up at Porthleven in your car with a kayak and a ladder, and then proceed to strap the ladder to your side of your kayak and then merrily go paddling off it out to sea. So it is quite strange, but it's a beautiful thing to do. And this is us with this is us paddling back from the site at Trorvus. And if anyone recognises it, this is one of the great climbs at Trorvus Head, if there are any climbers watching. So it's a great, as fieldwork goes, you know, kayaking out on a sunny day to look at kittiwakes is brilliant. And what we're doing with kittiwakes, the same that we do with cormorants, is to better understand how individual birds are using the colonies or using the space. We're marking them individually. So you can just about see there, this bird is CC. So each of these birds is getting a unique coded ring that allows us to then look at that in subsequent years. So again, this is why we know that today at Portreath I had 2 French birds and a Welsh bird, because again they had their unique identifying rings on them. And then we're also marking chicks as well. So a bit later in the season, where we can, the nests that we can reach safely with a ladder, we can mark the chicks in the same way. PV was a chick we marked in 2015, and although I don't have any good news about PV, I did see 2 of those birds of that cohort at Rinsey today. So I saw P1 and PL, which are 2015 birds that were recruited back into the breeding population at Rinsey this year. We've not managed to get to Trorvus yet, but I'm sure we'll find a lot more of our birds at Trorvus as well. So by understanding our birds as individuals, we can get a bit of a sort of better understanding of what they're doing. So I don't know if people can see all of this slide. I've lost some of it with my tiles of people. But you can see the kind of numbers of birds that we're ringing. And the interesting thing is all of these French-ringed birds. So we have 4 different French-ringed birds in those years, and then 6 French-ringed birds 2017, 6 in 2018. So these are French birds ringed as chicks in a French colony that are now recruited into the Cornish population and are breeding here. The bottom row, this is what it allows us to calculate. And if you do some clever statistics, you can look at the percentage of birds resighted, and you can work out what we call a survival rate. So we can look at the number of birds that are surviving from one year to the next. And again, on top of understanding productivity, understanding how many birds survive from one year to the next, that's what we really need to understand to be able to model a population. I'm sure there'll be questions, but maybe they'll pop up at the end. So I mentioned already the fact that we have this kind of Atlantic facing coast, and I called it the Celtic fringe, and that's actually an official thing. So the Celtic fringe, if I can get these right, the Celtic fringe is the Isle of Man, Cornwall, Scotland, Ireland. This is actually Galicia in northwest Spain. You got Brittany and you've got Wales. So that sort of group of countries makes up what we call the Celtic fringe. And the Celtic fringe shares a common flora and fauna to a degree. So if you think of where choughs exist in the UK, they exist in Ireland, the west coast of Scotland, the Isle of Man, Wales and Cornwall. And again, it's that Atlantic facing coast allows us to share a lot of our birds. And I want to just quickly look at some of our ringing results from the ringing group, which shows how important Cornwall is in a British context. So harping on about kittiwakes again. So these are all young kittiwakes. You tell they're young kittiwakes because they have this kind of they have this slight sort of bar in their wing, a little bit of shadow, a half moon behind their eye, and a bar in their wing. So we know these are first-year non-breeding birds, and these are photographs of birds down at Southerly Point on the Lizard. So we can look at all of the records of French-ringed kittiwakes that have ever been seen in Britain, and you come up with another graph which is brilliant. So all of these other little colours are irrelevant counties, I might say. The one we're interested in is blue. This blue is Cornwall. So you can see that there were no French-ringed kittiwakes reported in Britain in 2009, 2010 or 2011. From 2012 onwards, there were a lot more, and a lot more of them were in Cornwall. This is when I moved to Cornwall. So I moved to Cornwall in 2011. Too late to see any kittiwakes. So from 2012, because I'm a bit geeky like that, I went out looking at lots of sites where I might find ringed birds. But you can see the impact that we have, that the numbers have absolutely rocketed, the numbers of French ringed kittiwakes that we've seen in the country. And this is partly due to effort. So there are a few Cornish records before I arrived, but there are lots and lots more afterwards. So it is partly effort. But even though you can see, so this is Kent. Sorry, this isn't Kent. Wrong species. This is actually records of an ex-trainee from West Cornwall Ring Group who then went to Bardsey Bird Observatory, and these are actually records of French-ringed kittiwakes seen on Bardsey. So all it takes, so Bardsey is in northwest Wales. So all it takes is a bit of extra effort, and you'll start to see, you'll start to pick up a lot more of our sort of the birds that we share with our Celtic fringe neighbours. And this goes for a few different species as well. So great blackback gull, again, it's another one of those species that we talked about as being quite important on Mullion Island and on Lew Island. And again, you can see the big, so here, these are Kent. So we do have lots and lots of French great blackback gulls in Cornwall and in Kent. Again, it shows you how important Cornwall is for these birds. The last one is storm petrel, even more so. If we look at just, these aren't colour-ringed birds, these are birds that we've re-caught in the UK, in Great Britain Island. And you see that a vast majority of French-ringed storm petrels are caught in Cornwall. Okay, a few on the Isles of Scilly, a few Pembrokeshire, Devon, but really mostly in Cornwall. And this again just says how important Cornwall is for the seabirds that we share with the rest of Western Europe. So last up, I could talk about gulls for hours, but I'll try not to. So last up is urban gulls. And urban gulls are great. I absolutely love them. They're cheeky, so they're in there in shops stealing crisps, they're stealing pasties, they're stealing ice creams, pasties, ice creams, another ice cream, they're stealing chips. And it's a bird that has learned to adapt really, really well to living with humans. We've not adapted quite so well to living with gulls, but gulls have adapted really well to living with us. So what we've done, you might not be surprised to learn, is to find a bit more about what gulls are doing. We've actually started colouring birds. So we've done quite a bit of tracking work on gulls now. So the very first bird, you've got 000 there, which was one of the first birds we ringed back in 2012, I think it was, on the roof of Falmouth Marine School in Falmouth. And since then, we've colour marked just shy of 500 birds now, mostly in Falmouth, but also a few in St Ives as well. And just to put it into context, so that was 000, and if you can just about see there, that's 001, which I photographed just a few months ago on the roof of the cinema in Falmouth, opposite Falmouth Marine School. So that's one of our very first chicks that we've ringed, which has now survived through to being a breeding age adult in the population, literally right opposite to, oh, I'm blinding myself, that's better. Right opposite to where it was raised as a chick. So all that information is really fascinating. But obviously there's massive conflict. So we've done a bit of work in St Ives as well. So this was I'm a search and rescue person myself. So, you know, I completely understand the issues of going into a teenage girl attacked by a gull or swooped by a gull from behind, who fell off the harbour wall in St Ives and had to be airlifted to hospital. So there are real issues with our interactions with gulls. So we started doing, a few years ago now, we started doing some work in St Ives, which is actually funded by the BBC. And you can see in here, so this is on Rod's deck chairs in St Ives. This is one of our real regular birds. I think this is W186, which is a real regular bird in St Ives. And it's really a project to look at how often birds in St Ives are interacting with people, how often they're swooping down and stealing pasties off people. So what we did was we marked, we put GPS trackers on 4 birds originally in St Ives, expecting, and they had accelerometers in them and all sorts of cool things like that. We're expecting that we'll be able to look at how often birds were swooping down to attack people on the promenade, because that's obviously what seagulls in St Ives do. So St Ives is there. So these are just the tracks from one summer of 2 birds that we tagged in St Ives, and what we find is that those birds, they were nesting on a roof. I think one was on the roof of the co-op and one was on the roof of the cinema in St Ives. So they're true urban gulls, but what they were doing was spending all their time following fishing boats out from the harbour and following fishing boats quite far out to sea. Some of these birds even made it as far as Cork or County Cork in Ireland on their foraging trips. So these aren't necessarily just urban birds. These are birds that are nesting in an urban environment, but they're using a much wider environment to feed in. So that was 2. So the other 2, you think, oh, maybe they were just like hanging out on the harbour, stealing pasties. The other 2 spent all their time feeding in fields down towards Penzance and over to Hale. And what we found was that from the 4 birds, none of them spent any time in St Ives apart from when they were sat on their own nests. They all raised chicks, they all bred successfully, but none of those birds, though we might class them as urban birds, none of them spent any time in the town at all. They were just using it as a safe place to nest. And that's kind of the key thing from this, is that understanding a bit more about birds. If you speak to anyone at St Ives, they're like, oh God, yeah, they nest on the roofs and they steal your pasties. We can present them actual tracks of what the birds are doing. People don't believe it, you know, and you can present them a map like this in front of them and go, look, no, this is what they're doing. And people still don't believe it, but it's trying to, maybe after coronavirus, people will believe in science a little bit more, I don't know, but we'll see. But if you merge all the tracks together, you get something like this. So these are all of the tracks from those 4 gulls. You can see that all they do is they leave St Ives, they come down the coast, some come inland and they feed in fields here, others come along or come back. This is the estuary at Hale, so a lot of them are spending time here, but what they're probably just doing is feeding in the fields, and then they're coming along this track to bathe and clean before they come back along this track back into St Ives. And you can see their really specific use of very, very individual fields. So these urban gulls are really just spending all of their time kicking around fields. So not quite what you'd imagine they would be doing as urban gulls. So really, just to end, I mean, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of all sorts of strange things, but where we're at the moment, and kind of where I would see that we need to be going in the near future, is there is carrying on this year, so there are actually contractors out in the very near future under very strict COVID-19 guidelines, carrying out proper urban gull surveys across the rest of Cornwall. So we should have a better idea of a more complete survey of gulls in the county. But then also, as we saw for Kittiwake, it's important to understand how many birds are being produced by those pairs. We can count pairs, but how many chicks are they producing, and also how many of those pairs are coming back in subsequent years. So we have to have this better monitoring of populations. But then also to have a better look at understanding what kittiwakes are eating. So some of the stuff we do at Treorvis, if we're ringing chicks or adults, if they regurgitate anything, we keep it because we're sad like that. So it's looking at kind of what birds might be eating and kind of having a bit of a better understanding of what might be driving declines. But I'll leave it there, otherwise we'll have no time for any questions at all. So hopefully if I stop sharing my screen, yay, we'll ping.
Fantastic, thank you, Mark, that was brilliant.
Cool.
Does anyone, oh, here we go. Here we go. Katie Bellman asks, why do you think auks are doing so well in comparison to other species, even though they are so vulnerable to disturbance?
Why they're doing so, I don't know. I really don't. It's honestly a mystery to me, because it has been a steady decline over such a long period of time. They're able to feed at a much deeper depth, so I don't think they're as restricted as things like shags and kittiwakes are. That I think a warming sea, particularly at the surface, means that prey items are a lot harder to find, whereas guillemots and razorbills are diving much deeper to find food. So I think they're less susceptible to any issues with changes in prey species. That goes for shag as well. So shags are visual feeders. So if you have a long period of winter storms, then that's where we get shag wrecks, because they're keying in on feeding on fish by sight. So for them, a turbid water makes it really difficult for them to feed.
Great. Does anybody else have any more questions at all? Anybody?
There must be some about gulls or anything. You could unmute yourself and ask if you like. Is that allowed, or I don't know?
It might go a bit. Oh, here we go. From Emma Phillips, she asked, do you think there will be a spike in numbers of kittiwakes as a result of quieter coast this spring due to coronavirus?
Due to what, sorry?
Due to coronavirus and it being quieter around the coasts.
I possibly for somewhere like Newquay, it'd be nice to think that Newquay will have a with less disturbance of birds. I think birds in general might have a bit of a better start. So particularly something like chough as well, I think probably has a better start because and perhaps even peregrine, because they're less disturbed during the sort of key time at the start of the breeding season, that with fewer people walking out. I talked to Cheryl about this earlier, whether gulls would be impacted by having less food and pasties around due to coronavirus because people not eating out. And I think the St Ives example kind of shows that these birds, they might be in urban areas, but a vast majority of birds breeding in urban areas are feeding out at sea, and they're feeding on more natural foodstuffs. And we found that with some dietary studies we've done in Falmouth, that if you look at regurgitates of birds in Falmouth, it's always worms and beetles from fields. It's very rare to find chips and kebabs and things like that. We do find those, but it's actually quite rare. And I think most birds in urban areas are feeding on a very natural diet. So I don't think it would actually have that much of an impact. Probably less disturbance, so probably doing better.
Thank you. And Annika asks, how do you catch the birds to ring them, and which are the most angry when you do?
They're all pretty angry when we do. So cormorants we ring as chicks, so we can only ring cormorants as chicks, and that goes for great blackback gulls as well, so we only ring those as chicks. Kittiwakes we mostly ring as chicks as well, but we can catch adults with various nefarious means as well. So we can actually catch adult kittiwakes with what we call a noosing pole, which is it sounds brutal, but basically it's like a lasso for catching cattle on the end of a large, a 7-meter long carp fishing pole. And it sounds like it's horrible, but it's really not. And one thing that we have to be careful of is that we don't catch birds more than once, because we can catch a bird and we can ring it, and then we release it. And then there's a real risk that if we're targeting that area again, literally, we've ringed a bird and released it, and 5 minutes later, I've been about to catch a bird, and we have a spotter further along. We have little walkie-talkies, and they say, that's the bird you've just caught. And it's like, they don't learn. It's like, if that's a horrible experience, you should be scared of this. But they're just, they're so intent on what they're doing that, they're not disturbed at all. So we're absolutely sure that what we're doing, we don't disturb us. Hence cormorants, we don't go and ring young cormorants if there's any risk of disturbing the colony too much. And quite often we've paddled out, we've got there, and it's like, oh no, God, they're closer to the cliff edge than we thought. We spent ages getting all that kit ready, and all you can do is turn around and go back. The gulls that we caught in St Ives, we actually used a walk-in trap, which is like a maze trap. It's a trap where they can walk in an entrance, and then basically they just get confused and can't get out. That means we can target individual breeding birds. So basically, you take the eggs out the nest and put in dummy eggs so they don't damage them. Put the trap over, the bird comes back, and it's like, oh, that's my nest. And eventually they work their way through, sit back on the nest, and you can literally go and take them off. We can ring them, tag them, put the rear legs back in the nest, and release the bird. And generally, they're back on the nest within 5-10 minutes anyway. So yeah, different ways to catch them. As to which is the most angriest, kittiwakes probably. Adult great blackback gulls. I have lots of scars on my arms from adult great blackback gulls which were caught on rubbish tips. But chick point of view, cormorants are a little bit snappy as chicks, but of the birds we do, adult kittiwakes are probably the worst. So yeah.
Fantastic. And Amy asks, what's the rarest bird in Cornwall?
Rarest breeding bird in Cornwall would be, well, there's probably a couple of rarer breeding birds, but we can't really say what they are. So there's a couple of very rare breeding birds in Cornwall, but we generally don't say what they are because they're so rare. So there's a couple of species that have literally just started colonising Cornwall in the last few years, and that's quite exciting. But if you go away from the really rare things, then something like chough, we're still probably only on, I think it's like 14 or 15 pairs at the moment, and it's a species that's doing well. We do a lot of work monitoring choughs as well. I haven't spoke about choughs, but it could go on forever. So choughs is a bird that we do monitor, and that's probably about as rare as we get. We've lost some species, we've pretty much lost pied flycatcher as a breeding bird in the county. Not a coastal bird, but there are a lot of birds that we're losing. There's some that we're gaining, but there are some that we're losing as well. Corn bunting, that might be another species that's quite rare, and that's one that we're probably losing.
Thank you. And Annika asks again, do peregrines tend to stick in the same area?
In the same area?
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. We think at Porthmessen, the issue when the population really crashed there was the adults there actually were bringing their 3 chicks into Porthmessen to teach them how to hunt. So yeah, I think birds do, and the birds will habituate to that they teach their young to hunt peregrines and to take chicks, and that can be a real problem. And that's why kittiwakes will respond to that by just completely moving colony. So kittiwake used to breed in big numbers at Bosegran and Land's End and places like that, but they've moved on. Dave and Kate might correct me on this, but I think they used to breed in Ralph's Cupboard, but there was an issue with raven predation there, and basically they just move around different sites because there are a pair of ravens nesting in Ralph's Cupboard, and I think that predation risk is too much. So for any of those birds, ravens will take a lot of eggs early in the season and peregrines will take a lot of chicks later in the season. So when the predation pressure gets too much, the birds will just go somewhere else and start again.
Fantastic. Fran Walton would like to know, who do we contact if we find an injured or dead seabird with a tag or without a tag?
So probably the strandings hotline is your best bet for anything that you find. They probably won't be the best people to deal with it, but they will absolutely be the best resource to point you in the right direction. Because so if you find a live stranded seabird, your best bet might be someone like RSPCA. If you find a dead seabird, the strandings hotline will want to record it, and then equally they'll ask whether the bird is marked, and if it has a ring on it, they kind of know the questions to ask, and then that will get fed back to either myself or to the BTO. So the strandings hotline is always the best bet for anything like that. Anything on the coast, really, you know, the same as you would for a cetacean or anything else, really. That's your best first port of call, and they'll point you in the right direction.
Oh, Abby says the number for the Marine Strandings Network is 0345 201 2626. And finally, we've got like 1 minute. Anna is asking, could an increase in auk populations be due to a recovery from the wreck of the Torrey Canyon?
Possibly, although I could talk for hours on seabird wrecks. A lot of the seabird wrecks that have happened in recent years have actually quite happily involved, not happily in that way, but from a population point of view, they've mostly involved birds of a non-breeding age, which from a population point of view doesn't have much of an impact. So if you knock a load of, if you take out a lot of non-breeding age birds out of an auk population, it's a K-selected animal, then that doesn't have a population level impact. If you take lots of adults out of a population, so the which was the one that went, the Napoli that grounded in Branscombe Bay, that took a lot of adults out of the population, and that had a population level effect. The same with the PIB. It was a lot of adults, and it has an impact at the population level, so it's a lot more serious. So probably not. A lot of the spills, Torrey Canyon, and even things like tricolor and things like that, mostly affected young birds, so they were less of an issue.
Thank you, Mark. That's brilliant. I think that's all we've got time for tonight. If anyone does have any more questions for Mark, please do email them to us at seaquest@cornwallwildlifetrust.org.uk. Thank you ever so much. Thank you, Mark. That was brilliant. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone. Good night.